All right, it is July 4, 2025. Welcome to Borderlines. We are joined again today by Dan Hiebert. I hope I pronounced that right. It's your second time on. Perfect. And Dan is a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia in geography. He was previously on Borderlines probably about a month or two ago in one of our more popular episodes, which was about demographics and immigration. I encourage everyone who hasn't listened yet to go listen to that episode again or watch that episode again, depending on how you view or watch Borderlines. And in that episode, I guess the overall summary is that the immigration levels that we have had to date are not enough to set off the aging population or offset Canada's aging population, and that immigration levels would have to be much, much, much higher to do so at a level that is probably not politically feasible or that our infrastructure could catch up with. Is that pretty much an accurate summary? I know in the last we talked about it for an hour.
Sure. Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, given what you just said, which is perfectly correct, what that means is Canada or Canadians have to get used to the idea that Canada is going to get both older and bigger at the same time, right? So we partially offset the aging issue through having more immigration, but by doing that, we make a bigger population, but we don't fully solve the problem. So we still have an older population as well.
And there's the take that people had listened came back to me with was A, it was really interesting because it just highlighted how there's no easy solution, and B, it didn't dispel the notion that we need immigration to offset Canada's aging population, but it showed how it's an incomplete, if not impossible, picture.
Yeah. Given the super low fertility of Canadians, that is just a demographic reality.
Yeah, and the stat that still sticks with me is I might get these numbers slightly off, but from like 1975 to 2011, all the immigration combined lowered Canada's median age by, I think it was 8 months or 0.8 years or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Your dates are slightly off, but it doesn't matter. That is the general message that immigration doesn't do a huge amount in reducing the average age of Canadians.
Yeah.
But it's not that the age of the immigrant, of the newcomer population is it's dragging it down. It just doesn't lift it up, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, again, just we talked about this last time, but I'll just repeat myself. The average immigrant is 30, the average Canadian is 40. That's not a huge gap.
Yeah.
And so you need tons and tons and tons of immigrants to make an appreciable difference on the average age of Canadians.
Yeah.
Right.
And you recently published again for CD Howe a paper titled Fact versus Slow: How Different Immigration Rates Can Impact Canada's Economic Challenges and Regional Disparities. So the overall summary, and we're going to go through the paper and the individual charts, is that immigration does not go across Canada evenly, and that higher rates of immigration basically just mean greater growth in Vancouver and Toronto and some of the other big cities, and just accelerates the gaps and regional disparities of population growth, and so then to an extent economic growth in Canada.
Yeah, and if I could just connect it to what we were saying 1 minute ago, remember the what we focused on then was this balance between growth and aging. Well, the way immigration plays out across the huge landscape of Canada, some areas experience more growth and some areas are going to experience more aging. So that's the geographical reality to the demographic reality. So, and I use that very convenient, oversimplified way to understand this through fast versus slow Canada. So fast Canada are the parts of Canada that are attracting large numbers of immigrants. Slow Canada, that's the parts of Canada that are not attracting large numbers of immigrants. So immigration really makes the difference between the parts of Canada that have growth and slower aging populations versus no growth and rapidly aging populations. And the core then becomes immigration policy. It establishes basically the way that that's going to play out across the landscapes of Canada.
Yeah.
Maybe you can say, and perhaps this is entirely obvious to everyone, but like, why is aging such a key factor?
Yeah, there's several reasons. I'm an older person. I'm way above the Canadian average age, so I'm to some degree speaking of myself here. But the older a population gets, a couple of things happen. One thing is we know there's a very clear relationship between the cost of social services and the age of a person. We use a lot of social services when we're first born for obvious reasons, and education, natal care, all that stuff. Then we use relatively limited amount of social services through most of our adult life, and then we have a big pickup in our use of social services as we become elderly. And of course, as we get closer to death, that really becomes an extremely high cost on the social services system. So there's that. And then the other side of it is the older a population is, especially once you have larger numbers of people past the retirement age, the lower the ratio of people who are working compared to people who are being supported by that workforce. And that's what we talked about last time. That's the old age dependency ratio, which is a pretty critical of issue. And so what the new report shows is how that plays out across Canada. So we have different old age dependency ratios across provinces, not hugely different, but they are kind of, they really do, some of those differences really stand out. But even more importantly, we have really different old age dependency ratios between bigger cities, medium-sized cities, small cities, and rural Canada. The old age dependency ratio in rural Canada is kind of getting extreme, like really into some very challenging territory.
For sure. And what really fascinates me about this particular study is that it marries the idea of the aging population with the specific demographics of the population, because it's just a bit more nuanced. Because when you talk about, for example, the healthcare component, you can bring in a lot of very junior level people trained in the medical profession. But if what your issue is that like trickle down mentorship that is required, who's going to offer that? If you have if you're looking at age as a virtue in itself, but that means you're bringing in people without the experience and the education, and then you're losing that generation of institutional knowledge. Then I think we do lose out when you're seeing like people with 10, 20 years of experience who are not being captured by our immigration system because of the age issue. I think that you stand to lose and gain, gain on one side, lose on the other. So I love the idea of a much more intersectional kind of analysis.
Yeah, thanks. And having just heard what you said and your sort of celebration of complexity, I'm going to give you a very simple statistic, which kind of goes against the grain of what you've been saying, but it illustrates partly what you've been saying. And pardon me if I did say this last time, but I just think it's so important for Canadians to get this into their minds. If you look at the number of people in Canada who are poised for retirement, that is the number of people between the ages of 55 and 65, and compare that to the number of people who are poised to enter the labor force, which is the number of people between 10 and 20, you got an 800,000 person gap in comparing those two numbers. So, that and that relates to what I was talking about last time, the big national picture on that gap and so forth. The thing I want to talk about this time is that gap is highly uneven between places. That gap is less in Toronto and Vancouver and Calgary, say, where, there's lots of immigrants coming, and that gap really gets extreme as you go sort of down the urban hierarchy and to the slower growing parts of Canada, like the Atlantic provinces, for example.
And you can see this issue. Oh, go for it.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, like, even in the urban centers, like I think about this a lot in my own profession, that like, the entire the mentorship for junior lawyers. I
Yeah.
mean, I think articles are harder and harder to find. People are relying more and more on technology for doing more kind of, especially like in particular areas like litigation, given the difficulties of actually running a litigation practice. Like, how are we going to bring up that next generation when the kind of old guard steps away, And I think that, I think that a lot of people in a lot of different industries, I think, are having that same concern that there's, like, if you want to hire a 5 or 10 year call, there's a lot of challenge. If you want to bring somebody in and raise them up, then yes, you can perhaps do that. But, there's, I think a lot of different industries are in that same bind.
Absolutely. And another, like, law and other professions are very important. Another really important area are all the people who provide like really basic services to people in the smaller places in Canada. Like, how do you get a plumber when your toilet doesn't flush anymore? If the average age of a plumber is like 58 or whatever it is in these small places, it's not going to be long before you won't be able to get those kinds of services in smaller places in Canada. It's really going to be tough for people.
As with like most things, I think it's most pronounced in healthcare. Like in British Columbia, it seems like not a week goes by without hearing about some ER outside of Metro Vancouver that's going to be closed on weekends, if opening at all. And that's where the old age dependency ratio is skews to the most old.
Totally. Yeah. And even my friend who is in Vancouver and works as a surgeon says that when they say there's not enough beds, it's usually because there's not enough beds that have nurses attached to them.
Exactly.
Oh, of course.
Exactly.
Of course. I don't think it's the making of beds with blankets.
No, exactly.
Causing the issues.
Rooms for them to be in. It's like
absolutely
staffing those. And so, and I think, one of the ones that is so ironic at this point is in the construction industry, while housing is being flogged as the biggest concern, most construction companies are screaming that they don't have the ability to hire people, and that's why they can't take more jobs. So
and on that front, our entire immigration selection system is not really tuned to bring in construction workers, because we select the kind of people who don't want to work in construction trades, right?
Exactly.
The way we put such a premium on higher levels of education and so forth, that's just really not the right.
Yeah, the immigration
formula.
system's never dealt with apprenticeships that well.
No. And it hasn't, or if it does, it's somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur, who wants to start their own business, who's very sophisticated. But the self-employment, I don't know. I'm saying this because but working for oneself has never been the primary bread and butter. I don't think that they've ever had.
You don't get points. Self-employment doesn't get you points for Canadian work experience.
Oh yeah, we've tried. Canada's tried, as I'm sure you're very well aware, to have self-employment immigration programs, entrepreneurship immigration programs, investor immigration programs. It's really hard to do appropriate and productive selection on those fronts, because the system just isn't tuned for it, right? Like, how do you pick the next person who's going to invent Google or whatever?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
There's no way to really do that effectively.
Yeah.
Let's dive into the paper, and starting with about a third of the way through it, if not less, you pose some interesting questions that I'll just say here, then we can discuss them. Maybe before we discuss them, I'll also say some of the answers that I got on social media, which is, first, is it ethical for governments to attempt to shape where immigrants settle, especially when Canadians enjoy full mobility rights and are not subject to such constraints? Should newcomers be expected to support communities that Canadians themselves are avoiding or leaving? Second, is it practical to encourage immigrants to settle in areas where they will struggle to find meaningful work, given that locals are leaving these regions in search of better opportunities? In essence, regionalization programs risk distorting labor market signals and impeding the efficient allocation of labor across the country. So before we elaborate on this further, I did ask on social media what people's thoughts were on these questions. And so some of the answers that I got, an immigration consultant named Mahar says that its own regionalization programs are only ethical, according to him, if it's incentive-based and not coercive, and if it's paired with real regional investment that also respects mobility. And he agrees that immigrants shouldn't be bearing the burden of essentially saving rural Canada or trying to revitalize rural Canada or certain provinces alone. Amy Seaton said, I always encourage newcomers to initially settle based on the best job opportunity in Canada they can find. Most don't listen, and instead they all insist on coming to the Greater Toronto area and signing a lease in somewhere like Brampton ASAP to make money and then struggle to find employment. And then the last one, again, was immigrants like to stay in the cities because they can do double jobs and the transportation is not a problem. That last one was actually something that I hadn't considered, which is that if you are new to Canada and you don't drive, immigrating to rural Canada is going to be tricky.
Totally.
A practical
And
thing that I hadn't really considered until I read that tweet.
there's some very useful work that's been done on refugee resettlement in Canada that makes that point really effectively. You might remember, what was it, maybe early 2000s when we were really in that sort of moment when IRC, well, then it was called CIC, when what is now IRCC, got so enthusiastic about regionalization, they set in motion the idea of dispersing refugee resettlement, and they signed contracts with a whole bunch of service providers in kind of what you could say were unexpected places, like smaller cities and so forth. And one of the key things that the new refugees found when they got there was the transportation challenges. These were places where the average Canadian owns a car and gets around by car, and there's almost no bus service or any form of public transportation. So they were kind of in really difficult situation, trying to find work, trying to get appropriate services, learn one of the official languages and so forth. So yeah, you can't just discount the importance of mundane things like how do you move around? Where do you find
interesting
housing?
on that
What kind of housing is
politicization
available?
of regionalization. Like last year, Mark Miller, the then immigration minister, cut provincial nomination quotas by 60%, but at the same time told New Brunswick that since they had agreed to take refugees and the federal government wanted to, quote, spread refugees around, that's not a quote, that's just me paraphrasing, they wanted to spread refugees around, that New Brunswick would not lose its provincial nominee quota like all the other provinces.
Yeah, well, as I understand it, there was a kind of quid pro quo where if you took, so the challenge was Roxham Road and the number of unauthorized folks who were coming into Canada through basically Quebec particularly. And the challenge was, well, Quebec was no longer happy about that. And what do you do if you're IRCC? Do you just keep handing money over, or do you try to disperse the folks that were arriving in that really specific set of locations, or even one location in particular? And so the quid pro quo that was offered was, well, we'll take away your provincial nominee numbers unless you agree to take some of these folks and provide a kind of safety valve for the refugee or the asylum seeker issue to be more specific. And I never did follow up on that. I never did look to see which provinces took up that offer and which ones sort of said no thanks.
As far as I know, it's just New Brunswick is the only.
Yeah.
I have a really hard time with that personally. I think that first of all, when you arrive as a refugee, the idea of being told that, no, you need to go to this particular community, I think it does very much minimize the experience of the refugee journey, and to be told, now I'm going to send you to this particular community where there aren't going to be those accessibility things, like you've chosen a particular center, and that's usually a lot of forethought goes into why you've made your way. I mean, sometimes you don't have a choice about it, but again, for those types of decisions to be made without your control is very, the loss of sense of control is really an issue in itself, but also there really aren't those services, and those services can't just be offered in a new place all of a sudden. I think that the expertise that will be there in an urban center where there are people who've been working on this type of case for generations or whatever, I think that's seminal. You can't just train somebody who's been doing other types of settlement service to start working on refugee resettlement, because it's entirely different. It just bump against me, like, that our Constitution recognizes mobility rights as a fundamental right of a Canadian to be able to gain a livelihood anywhere across Canada, but that's not something that we recognize in terms of the rights of newcomers and refugees. Yes, I agree. If there's an incentive for them to go there, they might get a faster hearing, they might, but to say we're going to systematically deprive you of those accessibility things, of the quality of life, that where there are known barriers that you're going to experience. Like, it's not like there's a tribunal you can attend to. You might not be able to access, these various mental health supports and that sort of thing. And that's not something you can just do on Zoom. I understand that there's some accommodation that can be available, but it's just different.
Okay.
Sorry, Steve, do you want to say something?
No, go for it.
Well, I've got three things swimming in my head right now, and I just want to get them out there as a kind of maybe an agenda. You can decide whether you want to go there. But one of them is, like, what is the purpose of immigration, and, like, to what extent should we think of immigration as solving all of the problems of Canada? So that's like one little bucket to talk about. Another one is exactly what Deanna was speaking about there in her last few seconds, which is the availability of services and the kinds of supports that newcomers need. And I would love to throw out the example of Sweden, and if we have a minute, I'd fill that in a bit. And the third is the relationship between regionalization issues and productivity issues, like a really hard-edged economic look at all of that. So that's
interesting.
That's what's on my mind right now, and take your pick.
What do we start with? The third one, regionalization. I do want to get through this, the charts as well, because that was very popular in the last one. Why don't we start with regionalization, and maybe you can add that into this first chart in your paper, which talks about retention rates.
Which vary a lot
about regionalization, which is we encourage people to settle in different parts of Canada, and the data shows clearly that not everyone stays in the same province at the same rate. So
and just look at the variability there, right? So those who come to, say, Alberta or BC are about 9 in 10 stay, whereas those who come to Prince Edward Island, it's 3 in 10, right? So the retention rates are massively varied across Canada.
I mean, it's funny because another fundamental issue, I think, is that people look at asylees as, a taxing on the system. And I think that is part of the fundamental issue too, because I think, yes, at the beginning, they will require a lot of support and services. But I think that if you were to do a study of what kinds of things they are doing 5 years out, 10 years out, or what their children are doing, I find many of my clients who come to Canada as asylum seekers or refugees end up working in the healthcare sector or like a service provision occupation. And, some even do voluntarily go to a more unpopulated community because they will be able to get jobs in that field. But again, I think it's
StatsCan has a bunch of data on all that. Employment earnings and everything based on category of immigration. I'm not sure if they've tracked to the granular level. Oh, they probably have the retention rates. But I guess the question is this even a problem? Do you view it as a problem that people aren't staying in the province that they initially moved to, when, as kind of Dan was saying, what's the point of immigration? We wouldn't necessarily, or maybe we do, consider it a problem that someone moves from Newfoundland to Alberta to work on the oil rigs. Is that a problem? people often view retention rates, low retention rates, as being something wrong with the programs. But is it just natural that people are going to go to where the opportunities are?
Yeah. What I was getting at on that sort of what is the purpose of immigration is kind of, I wanted to just get people thinking about sort of good news story, bad news story, right? Canadians think of immigration very differently from people in most parts of the world. Canadians think of immigration as a problem-solving thing rather than a problem-creating thing, right? So go to Europe, talk to somebody about immigration, and very quickly you'll realize that their basic assumption that they're making in the conversation is that immigration causes problems. Whereas here we think of immigration as solving problems. And that's both a good news story and a bad news story, right? It's a good news story because it does make Canadians more favorable to immigration, does make Canadians more open, more welcoming to newcomers than people in most other countries. But it also puts a huge burden on immigrants, right? So we think, well, we have a problem with we can't find enough construction workers. Let's get a bunch of immigrants in to do construction work. We don't have enough people who want to stay in Newfoundland and Labrador. So let's get immigrants to stay in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we kind of expect them to do things that we don't want to do. But there's reasons we don't want to do those things, right? There's reasons why people aren't as keen to stay in certain parts of Canada than others because of economic opportunity.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, there is some granular data here on asylum claimants and their retention rates. And generally it's higher, which one would expect considering they're going to face not a good situation back home. Although it's still only, it's interesting also how it just varies a little bit. And again, for those listening, we'll link to the paper, like 50% of asylum claimants stay in Saskatchewan compared to an overall average of 62.
Yeah.
And it's lower for that province, or Manitoba also is lower than the general average. But again, going to the overall thrust of your paper, these retention rates do kind of show that regardless of where one initially settles, there's intra-provincial migration that occurs after.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. And, well, I guess you're kind of going to get to it later, or you're beginning to get to it now. One of the things I did in the paper was I compared what overall settlement patterns of newcomers look like kind of at the dawn of these regionalization programs compared to when these programs were kind of fully in place. And there's some quite interesting patterns that have changed, but also some patterns have not changed over that time period.
Well, the share for Ontario looks like it's decreasing with the regionalization efforts.
Yeah. And you
Although
can see
how many
BC,
again stay is yeah.
Yeah, that's true, right? This is based on census information, and I'm comparing the 2001 census to the 2021 census. And the census is good because that captures both like who first arrived and who's still there, right? So you're looking at a cross section of who's in the population in that particular year. So it's about the ones who are still there. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, and the next slide shows the cities as well. And it also just shows how Toronto used to just dominate the percentage of where.
But it still does, right? Like
it still does. It's
the
like
blue bar is from the folks that came in 1996 to 2001, massively focused on Toronto.
So
45%.
Yeah. But the gold bar is for the folks who came between 2016 and 2021, and Toronto's still pretty dominant, but not as dominant
close to
as it was.
30% there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what is this? I want to make sure I'm clear on what the population, that is like the Canadian population. I don't understand exactly what that.
Yeah, the dots give an indication of where all Canadians live. Like
I see.
What's the share of the total population of these places? And so Toronto's share of the total population is around 16-17%. That's where that little dot is on that first set of bars. But it's getting double that in terms of its share of immigration. It used to be getting triple that in terms of its share of immigration.
Wow.
Little footnote that you may find interesting. Canada has a really high rate of concentration in our biggest cities compared to many other countries. Look at Canada compared to the United States. You take the top 3 cities of the US, New York, Chicago and Los Angeles, they
Mhm.
account for a little more than 10% of the American population. Take the top three Canadian cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, you got a third, like more than 30% of the
Mhm.
entire Canadian population just live in those three places. And again, that's because we're more of an immigration-driven society, and immigrants are mainly moving to our big cities.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's very clear.
It's always interesting to note that because of Quebec politics, Montreal
Yeah,
is the exception to the rule,
yeah,
where
yeah,
the foreign-born percent is pretty much in line with the
Equal.
city's population.
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And that's a deliberate choice made by the Quebec government. If they made a different choice, that would look very different.
I
Yeah.
see.
Do you want to walk through this next chart? It's one of yours gets back into the
Yeah,
fertility rates and permanent immigration assumptions.
yeah.
That made the
So
first paper super interesting, and the same for this one, but it does require a bit of a walkthrough.
yeah, just to get people back up to speed. So what I did for both of these papers was I was able to get a custom population projection from Statistics Canada. And when you get a population projection, you have to make some assumptions, and then you get to make some variations. So the assumptions that we made for this population projection were that fertility rates would stay low. And I don't think there's any indication that that's a bad assumption. We made the assumption that we wouldn't see more net temporary residents coming. That's another whole topic we can talk about in terms of temporary residents to Canada, but we assumed that that would be a fixed, like a constant number. So we only varied permanent immigration rates. We made assumptions about longevity and these sorts of things. But so we made that set of standard demographic assumptions, and then what StatCan did for us was to vary the rate of permanent immigration from a very low rate that would be equivalent to about 120, 30,000 people coming per year to a really high rate that would be equivalent to about 750,000 people coming per year. And the middle scenarios are more realistic. They're more in tune with the kinds of levels of immigration that we've seen. So the second, third, and fourth scenarios are really quite realistic.
But Steve, maybe go
And
back for a second though, because for the audience that's listening, I don't think that that will have tracked at all. So the fertility rate being like 1.3, meaning that's like 1.3 child per, is that
yeah,
tracks?
Mhm.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And what we've seen subsequently, even a year on since this projection was done, is that the fertility rate of Canadians has actually declined a little bit more.
Right. Wow.
But
And then the
but
life expectancy being 80, like around 85 years for men,
yeah,
88 years for women.
mhm,
And then emigration rates being 1.5 per 1,000, like getting to that point by 2041.
yeah, yeah,
And then, this proportion of temporary residents, as you said, and permanent residency. And essentially so just like, even just for example, like spell out in sentence form what one of the conclusions would be based on this. Is that what you're doing now, Steve, to run
Yeah,
through?
that's this
Yeah.
chart of the
Okay, got it.
different populations by province.
Right. Okay, gotcha.
yeah. So on that chart, we're looking here at across the scenarios. Each column is a different. Well, the first column is the population in those different provinces or regions back
Mhm.
in 2021, the last census we took, and then each of those additional columns looks at the projected population in 25 years later in 2046,
Right.
depending on the different immigration scenario that you use. And as you move further towards the right side of that particular table, you get to the higher immigration scenarios. Further to the left side, you're at the lower immigration scenarios. And
Yeah.
if you just take a look at and one other thing, the kind of gold highlighted areas are those parts of Canada that will see population decline at
Almost no
under.
matter what, unless we get to super high
Yeah,
immigration levels.
Yeah.
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 So with low immigration, Quebec actually would have population decline, but as long as immigration is maintained in a kind of modest rate, or even, of course, a high rate, Quebec sees population growth. But Atlantic Canada has population decline almost at any immigration rate until you get to the real extremes, like 750,000 per year. nothing I can see in the appetite of Canadians for a rise in the permanent immigration rate to 750,000 at the moment, but that's what it would take to maintain Atlantic Canada's population.
Yeah, that would be like double and a half of what we've had at the highest levels.
Yeah,
well,
yeah, 1.5
temporary migration's
because
not
we had
factored in,
500,000,
but that's so difficult to try to measure.
Yeah, it's really about permanent landings.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I had noticed is, like, at some point, Alberta's population should cross BC's to become the third most popular province. It doesn't happen in any of the scenarios here by 2046, but it's narrowing quick.
Yes, the gap narrows
all
between
the
the
scenarios.
two. Yeah.
Right.
That could change, of course, if BC's economy becomes like faster growing than Alberta's economy.
And just affordability, I imagine, too, with BC.
Yeah. But no, that is, Alberta's really rising. Yeah. And then the table that you just rolled to now is taking the same logic and applying it to different sizes of places rather than different provinces. And so basically now the gold bit, the part that will see population decline, are the smaller places in Canada. So it takes an enormously high rate of immigration to keep smaller places in Canada stable in terms of population. But at those very high rates of population, what happens is the bigger cities of Canada arguably get overloaded in terms of the scale of population growth. So, under scenario 5, which would be 600 and something thousand immigrants per year, generally speaking, in today's terms, you see that is enough to sustain the population of those smaller places in Canada. But at the same time, Toronto would grow from 6.5 million to almost 13 million. It would double in size if you had that rate of immigration. So think of all the investment it took to create all of the transportation, housing, healthcare, schools, everything in Toronto, and then now double that in the next 25 years.
And then, one of the policy takeaways or practicality takeaways is, unless they take away mobility rights for permanent residents or citizens, which, as Deanna noted, is in the charter, no matter how much regionalization efforts there are, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver are going to grow.
Yeah. And can I go back to something that I wanted to talk about a little while ago, and that's the economics of this and the relationship between regionalization and productivity. You're stuck in a very difficult trade-off here. On the one hand, of course, it makes sense to want to preserve all Canadian places and to make sure that people have a good life in small towns and rural areas of Canada. But from a purely economic point of view, you want labor to go where it is the most productive.
Right.
And that's not where labor is going to be the most productive, right? So we've got a productivity crisis in Canada. And if we force dispersion of the population, we're exacerbating that productivity crisis. So that's a really tough kind of policy trade-off when it comes to regionalization. There's the social objectives versus the economic imperatives.
Yeah, there's another crisis in Canada. I don't think you had an image on it. It's discussed in the paper. Is, if you listen to the federal government, there is a francophone crisis, and there is a shortage of francophones outside of Quebec.
There it is.
And one of the things you talk about in your paper is that, at least based on historic definitions of francophones, they ultimately do tend to migrate, for the most part, not all, to Quebec, which is not the goal of the francophone migration program. Is there anything you want to expand on that Canada has a big goal of getting, can't remember if it's 4% or 6% of the population outside of Quebec to francophones? There's talk, and it would be interesting to know, I can even add this as a question. The Senate Standing Committee on Official Languages has said that 20% of immigrants should be francophone by 2035. If something like that were to happen, or this continued emphasis on francophone migration remain the norm over all else, what are the demographic implications of that?
Okay, so wow, so many things to say about that. First thing is, From a social point of view, it makes great sense, right? Like if we want to maintain the bilingual character of Canadian society outside Quebec, Quebec, of course, has a different view on all of that. That has to be done to some degree demographically. If you don't have people who speak French across the country, you're going to lose that very important characteristic of Canada. So socially, I have no quarrel with that. But from an economic point of view, and also from a secondary migration point of view, let's explore those for a second. From an economic point of view, there is no evidence that suggests that people do well who are selected for that, right? So if you select a francophone person and send them to Saskatchewan, I'm sorry, there's no evidence that that person's going to thrive in Saskatchewan, especially if they're unilingual francophone. Then you really have tough kinds of outcomes that are going to derive from that. So in a way, it's sort of forcing a limited set of opportunities on newcomers. And what, from another social point of view, like, why would we do that? Why would we send people into a situation where they're not going to succeed? Is that smart at all? So there's that whole thing. Then there's the secondary migration story, which is people adjust, right? So when you send a francophone, unilingual francophone person to a place where there are very few services and very few jobs, guess what? If they have mobility rights, they're going to leave.
Or they're going to learn English and become an Anglophone.
Yeah, yes, that is the other option. Of course it is.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. You're quite right. And so again, does that fulfill the objectives? And then Steve, getting back to what the targets are right now, the target is 4.5% of all immigrants to Canada should be francophone minority folks, francophone folks in minority situations, i.e. outside Quebec. But that target is rising to 10% by 2027. So it's a big acceleration.
To 12% for 2028.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're moving to that, maybe moving to that 20% figure that you identified a little while ago. And again, you're at the front end of this. You're seeing what actual people who are applying to Canada's immigration programs are doing. What I hear anecdotally is everyone is rushing to improve their French skills. So they're taking tutelage in French so that they can get the points required, to get them through the system. But they're going to forget French the minute they arrive in Canada, because they're going to go to a part of Canada that doesn't prioritize French, and it's a box ticking exercise,
For sure.
rather than something that is really going to improve Canada's social situation.
Yeah. I mean, it is very much like people go where people wish to be, where they feel that sense of community, where they have viable opportunities. And so that's why it's very interesting to look at this from a statistical, demographic kind of a perspective, because I think we feel anecdotally every day the disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it's wild. Anyway, that's our 10% quota of francophone topic on this episode, in line with the immigration target. This chart, and again, for those just listening, I'm going to post a link to the paper, just shows that under it kind of just visualizes what we were talking about, which is that no matter what level of immigration, Toronto's population as a percentage of immigrants will likely, go up. The more immigration there is, the more percent that Toronto represents, and the more percent that Vancouver represents. Montreal's, again, kind of flat. And the more immigration there is, somewhat surprisingly, this kind of goes to your point, actually. So it would be somewhat surprising until you read the paper. The more immigration there is, the less the percentage of the population is rural.
Yeah, because of where immigrants go. First, like, two things going on, right? All population growth in Canada moving forward is going to be immigration led. Point number one. And point number two, therefore, where immigrants grow, the places where immigrants avoid, decline. And so what you're seeing there is the more the immigration Canada has, the more the big cities grow and the small places just stay the same. So
And what I love about it is it just, as we were kind of open the episode with, the places where the crisis is the most pronounced, rural Canada, where the old age dependency ratio is the highest, you would think, okay, well, we need more immigration to deal with that. And the consequence or reality is that it will just lead to the increased dominance and percentage of the population that is Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and cities of 1 to 2 million people.
Yeah. Well, I would even go a little down and say cities more than 500,000 people are the places that are really drawing in the population. But Steve, I know we're going to be a little bit pressed for time, and I wonder if you could scroll down. I'm really keen on the population pyramids side of this. So, well, those tables look at old age dependency ratios, but you can kind of capture it by looking at those population pyramids. So what we're looking at here is on the left side, on the top, we're seeing the population pyramid in 2021 of Newfoundland and Labrador, not including St. John's. So like non-metropolitan Newfoundland and Labrador. And look how top heavy that already is, right? So it's really an old population. And then if you flip down to what that's going to look like in 24, no, stay on the same one, but just go to the bottom image. That's what that demographic situation of Newfoundland and Labrador looks like in 2046. And look at on the female side, the largest age group of women in Newfoundland and Labrador outside of St. John's in 2046 is going to be like 85 years old.
Right. But
it's like an old folks home. Basically.
Yeah, exactly. But is that wrong? And this sort of keeps going back to the question that Steve asked, and the question that you started out the paper with, like, is it ethical to try and shape that? And is there a way, even if it were deemed to be ethical, is there a way to actually change it? Because if eventually somebody is going to, no matter by what, like, mandate, you must go to rural British Columbia or rural Nova Scotia, are you not going to eventually end up retiring to, and so people go where they have the opportunities and the services, whatever it is. And so, it's about this fundamental premise about,
and legally, as you well know, given your backgrounds, you can only do this with temporary residents, right? Because permanent residents have charter mobility rights. So if you really want to force the issue of regionalization, you've got to do it with folks that are on temporary visas rather than permanent visas. And that, as you already know this, but maybe your listeners don't, that's what Canada has started with the Atlantic immigration program, is starting the whole idea of regionalization at the temporary stage.
Oh, and the rural, and there's the rural immigration community pilot
as well.
Northern. We have a question on YouTube, which is, hi, Stephen and everyone. I have a question. Should we be including wages in express entry? A lot of people argue that those who earn the same or more than median wage deserve some points. And that question sort of just highlights these different priorities, right? Like there's, as you said, there's the priority of if wages can be a substitute for productivity.
Yeah, which they are kind of,
to a degree. Should there be the emphasis on productivity? Should the emphasis be on regionalization? And there's just this tension that does exist. And I would say the third tension right now, and maybe this is a way of viewing it, is there's a tension between francophone crisis, productivity crisis, regionalization crisis, and what do we focus on? And these crises are kind of being replicated, as we also mentioned, in the asylum system, where that's not an economic immigration route, yet it's being pulled into this tension of, we want our asylum claimants to be spread out. Focus there.
Yeah.
I think though that the thing that's sad to me is that with the way that the federal government has clawed provincial nominee numbers back from each of the provinces, the capacity for regionalization has really it's taken a hit.
Because, definitely.
The ability for, the eastern provinces to say, really, we think you're going to settle better because you have family ties in this province, for them to select for that has been diminished entirely because they have such a small subset of the selection capability nationally. And, British Columbia is basically like, well, we don't have enough space, so we're going to dedicate it fully to healthcare workers, like they're having to make hard cuts because they have such a tiny allotment each. But I think that the regional disparities are significant. Like I think really Nova Scotia is going to know better who's going to stay in Nova Scotia, which ones are the successful test cases, but it's not going to be the same factors. It's what's going to keep somebody in British Columbia.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, a little paragraph in the paper, the provincial nominee programs mean different things to different provinces. For certain provinces, that's their primary way of getting immigration because people just wouldn't choose to go there unless they were coming through that kind of a program. Whereas with other provinces, BC is a good example, they use the PN more to tweak their specific labor market needs, right? And so that's why they moved so decisively into the healthcare area, because people are thinking of healthcare as a big crisis in British Columbia. So once again, immigration solved the crisis, right? We're back into that mentality. But BC has the luxury in a way of being able to do that because it doesn't have to worry about, well, how are we going to sustain our population in the first place through immigration? Because immigrants want to come here anyway.
Yeah.
Although to an extent where it's BC's reliance on immigration has kind of been exposed with now that the population is at a standstill, housing starts are frozen because projects aren't making money, provincial deficits are soaring. Like BC's been exposed a bit for perhaps over relying on immigration to solve our economy.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, it's that immigration will fix ... whatever problem you're thinking about. And as you say, in BC, there's been a lot of things that have been in that ... area.
And there were even like at some point there were low skilled, there were low skilled positions because what they were really needing was like hospitality, so they were able to it's not just about high wage. And again, I mean, I see Steve kind of pondering that one, but
well, I was just thinking about I was surprised you used the term low skilled.
Yeah, I know. I don't like the low skilled designation, but that's what they called the pilot project. Yes, that low and semi-skilled, But again, I think that it is where the actual labor market shortages are in that particular region. It's not. I think that the federal system sort of paints it with all one wide brush, and I think the provinces can titrate more to the specific demographic needs in a way that I think we've lost the capacity to do.
Yeah.
I'm interested. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to I don't want to stop you from saying what you were next going to say, but I want to say something anyway. So
yeah, please.
I'm torn. I just want to rewind to Steve's point about now look at what's happening in BC with housing and so forth. So here's a huge conundrum, right? If you want to give young Canadians a better life, make sure they have access ultimately to being able to purchase homes. That's a really important thing. And the way to do that is to reduce the price of housing. So there you go. That's in the interest of younger Canadians. Older Canadians, on the other hand, are depending on the price of housing to be high because that's going to fund their retirement. Right. So the difficult thing is the more you erode the circumstances that have led to price inflation in the housing market, the more you're helping young people and hurting old people. Tough balance to achieve.
Yeah, I totally agree. The thing that I was going to ask you about is you've referred at the earlier stages of this conversation to the Sweden model. And I'm just I just want to hear, is there another whole way of coming at this?
Oh, totally. Yeah. So this goes back to the conversation we had about asylum seekers. So in Sweden, I have to quickly go back. Historically, in Sweden, there was a huge push to create social housing in the 1960s. They had something called the Million Plan, massively ambitious. They built 1 million units of social housing in a population of 8 million people back in the 1960s. Okay, now that housing was built all across the country, but people have moved more to the cities in Sweden, just like they have in Canada. So there's underused capacity of social housing in smaller places. Okay, that's the context. Now, enter a whole bunch of asylum seekers come to Sweden. Sweden has this amazing luxury of being able to offer them, you have two choices. You're an asylum seeker. We're going to take some time to figure you out and decide whether you're qualify as a refugee, in which case we'll give you permanent residence. In the waiting time, you have a choice. We will give you state-supplied housing in a smaller peripheral place in Sweden, if that's what you choose, or you can get housing on your own. And of course, in that case, you're probably going to move to Stockholm or Gothenburg or Malmo, but that's your business. Then you have to pay for your housing. It's all on you. But that's where you see the idea of regionalization and social services really making sense, because the state of Sweden actually has something profound to offer people to move to these smaller places, which is state-supplied housing. We don't have anything like that.
If we get into, you have to go back about 120 years to the homesteading, where if you moved to rural Alberta, you got like an acre of land.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like
$5 back then.
That would, for me, be a viable way of actually building francophone communities, because I feel like it would happen naturally that, like, if there were refugees coming from land? What's that?
Give them land. Like, if
no, I think it means housing, not land.
Oh, housing. Okay.
But I do think that is what happens by nature. Like, that's why we have, like, people call it ghettoism, but like people move to communities where others that have their same language, like, and I think that there could be, like, a lot of refugees coming from the African continent who might end up congregating in a particular place, and all of a sudden you have non-Quebec francophone communities. There are other sort of, like, I feel like the idea of trying to force people into various boxes, and by that control, it's sort of like a free market economy, like allowing people to make choices that end up creating social I just think that it's the trying to create things by force is
and I mean, the way it's done in force is that it's very odd. If you, like, basically right now, you could have two people working. One could be someone earning, say, $200,000 working in healthcare in Vancouver as a doctor, or you have someone, and again, this isn't to compare jobs necessarily, but let's say you have someone working as a food counter attendant in Prince George, which is a small community up north, and the government, because of their caps, has to decide who gets to stay. Who gets to stay, right? Like, that's sort of this. What do you prioritize? Or if you want to add the third element, there's a French francophone living in Terrace, or like Richmond. Who gets to stay? And the way it's done through force is by telling one or two of those people they don't get to stay. Only one does.
Sounds like Survivor,
right? Final thoughts, just in the interest of time. I know we're getting questions on YouTube about processing times for certain streams. It's a bit beyond what we're talking about today. But again, just going to these trade-offs, actually, both of these questions kind of also pertain to the trade-offs, right? Startup visa processing times currently at 51 months.
Yeah.
Should they be removing cooks from the trades, since tradespeople can't compete against cooks? All of these are just different prioritizations that the government has to make. And so while they aren't directly related on regionalization, it reflects, again, each of these reflects different program trade-offs.
And frankly, I mean, just to add to that, I think the startup visa program overall, and this is a massive generalization, I don't believe it's on the top of the department's list of favorite programs. And again, it is a massive generalization, but I think it's going to be low on the priority list.
There was actually an evaluation of the startup visa program. If memory serves, it was 2023, I think. It would be, those of you who specialize in that area, and I know a number of your listeners do, go back and look at that evaluation and see what the outcome numbers look like. I'll leave it at that because I know we're running out of time, but it's not a super happy picture. Just people can do that. But Steve, you asked for some closing thoughts, and I'd like to give a closing thought if I could. The other two of you, of course, are welcome as well. But my closing thought is, again, it goes back to the point that Canadians need to be prepared for what's coming. And what's coming is this combination of growth and aging. And it's going to play out differently across the different parts of Canada. In those parts of Canada that are growing, I don't think we're prepared for the scale of growth that we're going to be seeing. And we didn't have time to look. I have a table that looks at Toronto under different immigration scenarios. Toronto's going to grow a ton under any immigration scenario. Like, are people being prepared? Are they building enough new school capacity? Are they building enough ER capacity? All that kind of stuff in the places that are growing. Meanwhile, in the places that are going to be seeing population decline and acute aging issues, are we putting the proper set of services in for those places as well, right? Like, there's a really important set of geographical nuances, maybe nuances is too weak a word, differences that need to be really taken into account. And that's my closing thought. I don't think we're well enough aware of how differentiated our demography is going to look as we move forward. And I don't think we're therefore prepared for that.
It's like that meme, Canadians need to be prepared, but best we can do is complain on Reddit.
Yeah, but I think that the last thing you said about the Sweden model is that I think that there are different ways to be doing things than what we are currently doing, and just kind of forging ahead with this idea of like just trying to control, that there needs to be innovation in terms of that critical thinking.
Yeah, awesome. This was fun.
Yeah,
thanks
definitely.
for coming on again. Let me know if you have any other papers coming up, because they're always fascinating. They always make me think. They always offer paradigms that, like, it's the forest through the trees kind of thing. Deanna and I get a lot of trees.
If I could, I'll just say one quick thing on that. So the next project I'm tackling is the question that Deanna, you spoke about, of the role of ethnic enclaves in Canada. Do they help people, or do they hold people back? So
yes,
that's my next little bit that I'm.
Well, that's a big one. I'm super fascinated and look forward to talking with you about that one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.